Okay, awesome. Thanks for joining, everyone. Looks like a very full room. It's a bit intimidating. So my name's Athena. I'm a speech pathologist, and I come from Language Disorder Australia. So I'll give you a quick recap of what our organisation does and what the three arms of our organisation are. Hopefully this clicker is working for us. Beautiful. So Language Disorder Australia has three arms to the organisation. So under Language Disorder, the Language Disorder Australia umbrella, we have our Bright Door services, we've got our school support services, and we also have Mansell College. So starting with Bright Door is our fee-for-service clinic. So we offer OT, speech pathology, music therapy, psychology, physiotherapy, speech pathology services. And those locations for Bright Door do cover Brisbane and Townsville. And then we also have Mansell College, and we've got some colleagues from Mansell College today. So Mansell College is a specialist school, P to 12, that supports students whose primary disability is language disorder. And then we also have the school support services team, so that's my team, and I've also got a colleague here, Sherry, you see over there in the green dress. So with the school support services team, that's the funded arm of our organisation. So we're funded by the department to go out and provide a consultative service to schools to promote inclusion and kind of give school strategies to support students to access the curriculum when they have potential barriers to their learning. Okay. So the components I'll be covering in today's presentation. I'm going to talk about the key components of language and what is language, and then I'm going to move into the definition of what is language disorder, the statistics around that, and what that looks like, especially for our populations with Down syndrome and intellectual disability. And then we're going to move to the classroom context, and I'll quickly go through some classroom strategies. And now, I've tried to kind of condense hours worth of presentation into 35 minutes, so we'll see how we go, but hopefully even if you want to take some notes as you go or some pictures, and feel free to ask any questions after if you want to come and grab me or Sherry in the break, you can definitely do that. Now, we're going to start with a bit of an activity first. So you've got a bit of scrap paper in front of you and pencils or pens. And what I want you to do is I'm going to give you some instructions, and I want you to try and follow these as best as you can. So even if you're not sure about them, no cheating, no Googling, nothing like that, just give it a go. Okay, everyone looks very ready. So the first thing I'm going to get you to do is draw a large spitty. Draw a large spitty. Give it a go. Okay, a couple of people having a bit of a good guess here at the front table. Okay, now that everyone has their large spitty, next add a puerta. So add a puerta to your spitty. Okay, everyone's got their puerta. And the final step, I want you to add an iso flower outside your spitty. So an iso flower outside your spitty. Okay, a few people looking a little bit confused. So these were my instructions right here, and what I've done in this slide is I've highlighted those words that you didn't know. And the reason why you probably didn't know these words is because they're from other languages. Now, is anyone brave enough to kind of share their little drawing with me if you want to put your drawing up? No one's feeling brave. Okay, so what I might, oh yes, beautiful, very good guesses, very nice, brave. Now, can you have a bit of a compare with your neighbour and see what your drawing looks like compared to your neighbour's? Does anyone have the exact same result to their neighbour? No. Okay, so I'll reveal the answers here. Did anyone have that? No. Okay. So this is a bit of an example for everyone. So the words I've highlighted here, of course, are the words you don't know, but you knew every other single word in that instruction. Why weren't you able to complete it? What do you think was a barrier in this activity? Yep, some people are saying the highlighted words, exactly. Now, this is kind of, this activity kind of emulates what it might feel like for a student with a language disorder in our classrooms. So sometimes we kind of assume they know the majority of the words I'm using, and just those 4 words that are highlighted there made you completely, have something completely a different result down to what was the target. And this is something that we need to consider with our students with a language disorder in our classrooms, because just by those few little words that they're not understanding, that's going to lead them to really misunderstanding the whole of an activity or an instruction or the lesson content even. Now, does somebody want to put their hand up and bravely answer, how did you feel doing this activity? Hands up if you felt happy or confident in what you were doing. Who felt confused? Who felt frustrated? Okay, so again, these are some really good considerations for us when we're working with these students with a language disorder, because we know the curriculum is full of language. So imagine being in a classroom with language constantly used that, a lot of our kiddos may have gaps, and how frustrating that must be for them. Now, starting here with a beautiful quote from Professor Gina Comte-Ramsden, and she's a researcher in language development, and she gives us this beautiful quote here saying, "From infancy, language is integral to just about everything we do, share, understand, perceive, and achieve." So in other words, language is pretty much in everything we do. So think about your everyday life. Think about your career, your job, those mundane activities you're doing every day, your hobbies, your socials. Most of those, if not all of those activities, will in some form involve language. So imagine what a big barrier it would be having a language disorder. Okay, so let's kind of look at the definition next of what is actually language. Now, speech pathologists, we still use this very old model by Bloom and Leahy, and we still use it because it tends to work really well for our needs. So this is a nice way for us to try and conceptualize what is language, because language is very fluid, it's very abstract, there's a lot of components to it. So this is kind of the easiest way we can conceptualize that. Now, our oral language or language system is made up by 3 main areas, and those are form, content, and use. And I'll talk through what those actually mean and what that looks like. Now, starting with form, that's more the part of language where we're using our grammar skills. So thinking about things like syntax, so your word order in a sentence, that sentence structure. So if I say the sentence, the dog jumped over the cat versus the cat jumped over the dog, I'm using the exact same words each time. My vocab isn't changing, but that syntax, that word order, is changing the meaning of the sentence. So that comes under that area of form. Now, another area that comes into form is that grammatical morphology. So that's the grammar applied at that word level. So for example, I might take the word cook, the verb, I can make it cooking, I can make it cooked. I can maybe also change that word to a noun. I can say 1 cook, 2 cooks in the kitchen. So all those individual adjustments that I'm making to that word falls under that morphology in that overall form circle. Now, the next area that form also covers is speech. So the speech sound or the phonology is what makes our language unique from other languages. So thinking about in English, for example, or Australian English more specifically, all the individual sounds we're pronunciating to use in our words. So that's also an important part of our communication. Now, moving to content next, this is the part of language that is involved more with our vocabulary. So thinking about our word meanings, thinking about the words linking together and how we carry in our semantic system, so that lives in our brain basically. It's how our brain stores vocabulary knowledge. So when I'm exposed to a new word, that's eventually banked into my semantic system, and then I can use that new word and understand that new word. So that's also very important to our language. And finally, we have the circle of use. And this is more that pragmatic or social area of language. So thinking about things like conversational rules. So being able to understand that a conversation is that back and forth and not kind of hogging the conversation. That is applied from our use circle. Thinking about topic maintenance. So I'm over here presenting to you today. So hopefully I'm staying on topic. I'm not talking to you about my upcoming holidays. So that's my use skills coming into play here. Adhering to social rules, correct etiquette in conversation, and obviously matching language to the situation. So for example, again, thinking about us here today, a lot of us are probably going to use formal language during our presentations, but maybe during the break we become a little bit more informal. So that kind of makes up language. So let's now have a look at what is a language disorder. And I'm going to start with this video. Let's see how it goes with playing.
Confusing, 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 confusing. Darcy. Confusing. Confusing?
You're not doing it right. Darcy's ruining it. No! Rules, 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 rules.
I don't get the what you thing that you have to what to know.
Are you listening? Should we try again?
Beautiful, I'm glad that worked. Hope everyone's got some tissues there. It's quite an emotional video. I've had to watch it quite a few times to kind of not trigger an emotional response. So that's a very good example in this video. They've done a lovely job, and this video has been done by Rattled, which is raising awareness for DLD. So this is an example of how a language disorder may appear in the classroom. And again, the students we're talking about today are a little bit different to Darcy, and I'll talk to you through why in a moment, but it still gives a very good example of how those language difficulties in a classroom may look and may feel like for our students. Now, moving on to our definitions today and the statistics around that. So we use the term language disorder to describe that group of students or young people that appear to have persistent language difficulties. And those language difficulties can be in any of the areas that we discussed before when we looked at the 3 circles of language. Now, specifically with terminology, or I guess overall looking at what a language disorder is associated with a biomedical condition versus what DLD is, which is what Darcy had, we use the specific term language disorder associated with a condition when there is something like a primary diagnosis such as ASD, an intellectual disability, Down syndrome, it might be a traumatic brain injury, cerebral palsy, or sensory neural hearing loss. So that's about 2.4% of our population that will have a language disorder associated with one of those conditions. And like any disorder, this can range from being quite mild to moderate to severe. And of course, that level of severity is also going to impact how much of a child's day-to-day activities, they can face some difficulties in those. Now, when we look at the term DLD, like we had in the video more specifically, that is the group of children that have a language disorder with no other explainable cause. So their DLD is not associated with a biomedical condition. And we can see here that 1 in 14 children in every classroom will have a developmental language disorder. Now, we've also got some data from a recent Australian study, and we're saying now that in Australia, approximately 6.4% of our 10-year-olds meet the standard meet diagnostic criteria for a DLD diagnosis by age 10. So that's quite a high percentage if you think about it. Now, moving on to our next slide. So when we look at language disorder and DLD coming together as a statistic, that equates to about 10% of the population. And if we were to extrapolate this same data to a classroom, that's 10% of our classrooms having some students either with a DLD diagnosis or a language disorder associated with another biomedical condition. And we know this is going to be a lifelong disability because language is fundamental to everything we do across our lifespan. So that's really important to consider there in supporting and advocating for these young people. Now, looking at some difficulties that come with a language disorder, whether it is more that language disorder associated with or more that DLD kind of sense to it, when we're looking at word form, form in general, some things or some difficulties we may notice with our students, they may have a lot of difficulty using correct tense in a word, or maybe that subject-verb agreement isn't correct. So they may be saying things like, they is walking, or he are walking, for example. So those would be examples of some difficulties there. Or maybe they have difficulties applying plurality to certain nouns. Sometimes you may see when it comes to that syntax, so that word order and the sentence structure, maybe some of their sentences are incomplete, or maybe they're good at using some really simple sentences, but they're not quite sure how to expand and add further details to their sentences. And in terms of their speech, we may see difficulties with saying particular speech sounds. They may have difficulties with using appropriate stress in words, or maybe even some difficulties with intonation. So any of those difficulties would fall under form. Now, looking at content next. Whoops, forgot to do some clicking here. So looking at content, this is where we would see those vocabulary difficulties coming into play. So that could look like misunderstanding certain words or misusing certain words. Those words that have multiple meanings, some of these kids don't necessarily discern between the meanings of those words. So when they see the word play in a sentence, are we meaning play as the verb or play as the noun, for example? So a lot of these kids will struggle learning more that academic vocabulary in particular, so those tier 2, tier 3 words, so your more technical words as part of the curriculum. Another difficulty you may see in these students is that you may see that they have word finding difficulties. So you know when you have that tip of the tongue state and you're saying, oh, I'm trying to think of the word, or I'm trying to think of someone's name and I know what their name is or I know what the word is and I need a bit of a prompt to get that out. So this is what these students may experience, but more frequently. And other difficulties in general you may see with these students, difficulties defining words. So they may on the surface appear to understand certain words, but when it comes to them providing a definition, that adds extra difficulty to them. Now, looking at that use circle next, some difficulties that we may see in this area, it may be those difficulties with not understanding those social etiquette, so not understanding necessarily how to match the language to the situation. So it may be that student at your school who walks up very confidently to your principal and goes, hey mate, So it might be that kid. It may look like not using that back and forward flow in a conversation, or maybe they don't know when to interject into a conversation appropriately. And a lot of these kiddos as well may miss non-verbal cues that are happening in a conversation. So if you're looking like you're a bit confused with something they've said, they're not necessarily picking up on that cue to then go back and repair that conversation or provide some further explanation, and they might just continue on through. Oops. Now, when we look at our populations, especially our kiddos with Down syndrome, these are some things that we need to consider, especially from a classroom perspective. Generally, we're saying that our babbling and pre-linguistic communication, so that's our early things like joint attention, our play skills, imitation skills. So generally, that can look to be quite on par with their peers. But as language development continues to expand across the early years, then we'll see that gap starting to widen more progressively. When it comes to that vocab more specifically, this is where we see a wide range of skills. Some kiddos with Down syndrome do really quite well with their vocab. They may have a large vocabulary, but other students may have a very limited vocabulary. So that's going to be more a case-by-case thing rather than all kids with Down syndrome fall into this box. A typical thing we also see as part of Down syndrome, we do see our kiddos having more word retrieval difficulties. So that's where they know the word, it's that retrieval from the semantic system and finding the right word to use. So you may see that they're using very generic vocabulary. So rather than saying the word that they need, they may substitute with thingy or the watch-the-magic. So those non-specific words. In particular, this population may also have difficulty with understanding and recalling information that's presented auditorily to them. With their receptive language, typically this is stronger than their expressive language, because oftentimes with their expressive language, like we said, they do have some of those word-finding difficulties, and they will also have some difficulties when it comes to syntax, so that sentence structure and knowing how to put a sentence together. Now, moving on to more some, not necessarily language, but more general communication characteristics we need to consider for our kiddos with Down syndrome. So firstly, when it comes to hearing, this is going to be an important factor here because we have a high incidence of sensory neural hearing loss in this population, and about 96% of our kiddos with Down syndrome will also experience middle ear infection. So that's going to be another factor when it comes to them developing their speech and language skills. Because having those difficulties with hearing is going to pose extra risk in the domain of speech and language. Now, when it comes to speech, so that's more that speech intelligibility, using correct speech sounds, we know that compared to other groups of kids with an intellectual disability, some of our kiddos with Down syndrome will have more difficulties using correct speech sounds. Especially to unfamiliar adult listeners, they may have more difficulty understanding them, especially if they're really young and they haven't quite had a lot of intervention yet. There may also be some motor speech difficulties. So this is where the sort of the muscles may be affected, for example, that planning of the speech movements. They also tend to have quite inconsistencies with their speech. So for example, let's say a student is trying to say the word cat. On one occasion, they may call it an at. On another occasion, they may drop the final sound and say cat. Another occasion, they may call it a tat. So you can see all those variations in that production of cat. It's not necessarily consistent. It's a different production with a different speech sound error each time. Now, we also need to consider some anatomical differences here, and that's also going to be a factor in that speech sound development because we know these kiddos will generally have a smaller oral cavity, larger tonsils or adenoids, and that's also going to further impact their speech sounds. Again, with therapy, they can make a lot of gains in this realm, but those are some factors we need to consider for them as well. And you often may see that some of these kiddos often speak quite quickly, so their speech rate is quite fast, and that can be for a variety of reasons, but one of the primary factors to that may be that poor breath control and breath support, so not quite holding that air for long enough to then sustain and talk for a longer period of time. So on that one breath, they're trying to get as much out as they possibly can. And some very quick considerations around voice. They may sound a bit breathy or hoarse, especially if they're running out of breath quite quickly when they're talking. We know that about 45 to about 53% of this population do also present with a stutter, so that is a fluency disorder. And some of these difficulties will also create some anxiety in our kiddos with Down syndrome, and because they may be quite aware of their communication sounding different to their peers, or they know communication can be difficult, so they can become quite anxious and nervous about communicating as well. So moving on to this next model, because speech pathologists here, we love our models. This is another model that we also like to use to try and conceptualize different communication difficulties. So this is by Bishop et al. So this general model captures speech, language and communication needs overall. So you'll see in that orange and yellow circle on the left side there, that is our general population with a language disorder, like we generally talked about before. The orange area in particular is the language disorder associated with a particular diagnosis, like we said, with intellectual disability or Down syndrome or maybe autism. And some of those characteristics that are shared between a language disorder and DLD you'll see in that yellow area there. So difficulties with that syntax, morphology, word finding like we talked about before. And again, the difference between language disorder and DLD is that with DLD we don't have that associated biomedical condition. So their language difficulties are not better explained with a primary diagnosis. Now, for our population of kids with Down syndrome, again, they will have those difficulties in that yellow kind of area, or orange area, I should say, and some overlap with a speech sound disorder as well. So that might be something like a dysarthria. It could be definitely that phonology circle you can see there. It could also be some orofacial differences there that also come into play that are further affecting our speech sound production. And this model also shows us about voice disorders and fluency disorders, and that's something also we consider for our population with Down syndrome. And down the bottom, we also have an area called lack of familiarity with ambient language. So that would be that we're differentiating between the population of students that have difficulties with language, not because of a disorder, but maybe they're not familiar with that language yet. Maybe they don't speak English at home, for example. So that population would better be captured in that bottom area there rather than a language disorder. Now, moving on to the classroom presentation of a language disorder, and again, this can apply to both that language disorder associated with a particular biomedical condition or more that DLD kind of space. So some things you may have seen in your own classrooms with students with a language disorder, you may see difficulties with your students following instructions. And this may look like they don't have the attention, that they're not sustaining their attention long enough to follow the instruction. It may be that they don't actually understand the instruction that's been provided, or maybe they hear the instruction, feel quite overwhelmed and don't know where to start with it, and that would be more of an executive functioning difficulty in that space. You may see your students sometimes slow to respond or not keeping pace with the rest of the classroom, and that's because, again, they may not have the attention skills, or maybe they need more processing time to kind of understand that language that is used. Now, difficulties with paying attention, forgetfulness, disorganisation can also come across in the classroom. It may be that student that is always forgetting a particular item for a specific class. So it may be that student that comes to art and doesn't have any of their art supplies. You may see as well some of these students that are aware of their difficulties, they'll be looking to their peers to cue off them. So, I'm not sure what I'm meant to be doing, I'm looking around to see what everyone's doing and I can hopefully copy them. You may see some difficult behaviours in the classroom. This may look like meltdowns, for example. It may look like defiance, or it may look like poor motivation. And again, if language is hard, that's not going to be surprising for us. That would be like somebody asking me to exercise every day. It's not going to happen. So I'm not motivated for the task, so it's going to be hard for me to do that and enjoy doing that and participate in that fully. Now, some of these students, we may have incorrectly labelled them as being a bit inappropriate or a little bit immature compared to their peers. Or maybe they're using their social skills to try and be the class clown, for example, because everything else in the class is difficult. Let me use my humour to kind of get by through this. Some of these students may also appear a little bit less obvious. Maybe it's those students that are really quiet. They can be anxious or withdrawn. And eventually this can also look like school refusal. So if students are refusing to come to school, we really need to question why that might be the case. And of course, like we said before, when it comes to that youth circle, so those social skills, it's going to be hard making friends and also keeping friends. So you may see that these students may look a little bit lonely, or maybe it's the type of student that is having a lot of conflict with their peers. Now, as language is in everything we do, like we discussed before, implications with language disorder without intervention can also lead to social, academic, and emotional difficulties, and later, of course, as well, to employment difficulties. So we need to really consider this for our populations, especially as we're trying to promote inclusion, get them onto NDIS and early access and early supports, because a lot of these students or these kids and young people with a language disorder will need different supports throughout their lifespan. Now, moving to the classroom. Oh, how am I going for time? Okay. So looking at some classroom strategies here, I'll quickly go through these. And again, if I don't have time to expand on them, don't panic. I do have some extra information in there, and feel free to come and see me or Sherry after to ask us any further questions. But strategy number one, understanding the profile of your student with a language disorder. Because every student with language disorder will be very different. Some kids may need more support in the vocab. Some kids may need more support with the social-emotional side of things. So different profiles, different strengths and different challenges. We know, though, that all students with language disorder can learn, so that is not going to be a difficulty. In particular, things that we can consider here is something like a UDL, so the Universal Design for Learning, where with the UDL kind of space, we're assuming that the difficulties lay in the student's environment and not with the student themselves. So their challenges are not necessarily a barrier, it's more the way that the classroom is set up or how lessons run. So definitely look into more that UDL space if that's something that you're interested in doing. So talk about the how, the what, the why of UDL. So looking at how we can better present information to our students, how we can better look at that assessment space. Like Deborah was talking about before, that UDL model could work really, really well. And really what we're doing is we're opening doors with UDL and closing the gaps for our students. Now, this next slide here as well will also be handy when we're applying that UDL, and it's about that consultation as a team. So this is where teachers and speech pathologists, also parents, need to all come together to kind of talk about the profile of our learners and seeing what we can do, what we can implement. When it comes to classrooms, teachers often refer to language as reading, writing, literature, debating, classroom conversations, and so on. For speech pathologists, though, language does mean that whole oral language environment that is required to communicate, to operate in a classroom, to learn, everything that comes with it. And oftentimes we know our teachers are not explicitly always taught about a language disorder throughout their training, and it might be in the classroom that that's the first time you've heard of that term. And yet our teachers are still expected to be that key change in education. And sometimes for a student with a language disorder, our teachers are the ones who are kind of raising the flag there and saying, oh, we're having some difficulties here that aren't better explained with everything else we're doing, so this is something we need to further investigate. So oftentimes you guys are the first point of call. And also, you're still expected to plan and teach and assess these kiddos with a language disorder with a lot of confidence. And that's hopefully where a speech pathologist may come in hand. So speech pathologists who work in education can hopefully help teachers to map the language profiles of these students against the curriculum descriptors and the achievement standards as well, and to design language adjustments to maximise that participation in the curriculum. And we're, again, minimising those barriers as much as we can. So coming together, speechies and teachers, very good outcome, would recommend. Now, coming to our third strategy, so consultation with our learners. And again, that's going to be following on from the previous slide. This is also going to be really important because the disability standards of education tell us that students need to be consulted about the types of adjustments that they receive. So they need to be an active voice in that process as much as possible. Now, having a disability, that's also going to affect how a student can stand up for themselves, how they can communicate independently. So those are some big conversations we also need to have around enabling that self-advocacy in our students. So Hayley Tancredi has done a lot of research in this particular space, and she actually interviewed a lot of students with a language disorder around what types of classroom adjustments, or what were the main classroom adjustments that were considered by these students. So she kind of categorised these in the following themes. So she talked about how students communicated to her about how teachers communicate. So some students benefited from really clear information in the classroom, really clear information of linking that new information to old information around what do I already know and how does this new information fit into this. Other students talked about how teachers give instructions. Some students felt that teachers were really quick to give instructions and didn't have enough of any pictorial supports in that. Some students found that they understood the instructions, but maybe too many instructions were given all at once, so they needed more of a one instruction per time. Subject and lesson content was another big thing. And again, this is about connecting the content of what the student already knows to what they have already learned. How does this link in with what I already know? How does this come in handy? The next thing they talked about is changing the environment. So they wanted more time for repetitions in a classroom, more times in exams, and definitely the use of assistive technology. And this was a really big one because I know sometimes when Sherry and myself go out to a lot of schools and when we're supporting our teachers in implementing certain strategies, sometimes I feel that teachers, they know, you guys know exactly what you're doing and how to do it, but sometimes we find that certain teachers need a bit of empowerment that, yep, you're doing the right thing. Because sometimes what teachers think is that I don't want to feel like I'm giving them too much assistance. And like Deborah talked about before, this isn't the case. We're not giving them more help compared to the other students in class. We're giving them exactly what they need. And a good example of this would be, let's say you had a student with a visual impairment. Putting them up in the front of the classroom would be a very reasonable adjustment. Allowing them to have glasses on, that's a reasonable adjustment. It's not giving them extra help, it's giving them exactly what they need. So we want teachers to feel empowered to put in those strategies and don't feel like you're giving them too much help, because if language is difficult, those extra strategies are going to make a difference. Now, moving on, building a language-friendly classroom. That's our fourth strategy today. And Julia Starling, if you haven't heard of her before, do look Julia Starling up. She's got two fantastic programs. So one is Link Up, so that's her program for primary school, so the middle of primary school to upper primary school. And then she also has links to support our secondary students. And she talks a lot about how to make language-friendly classrooms. So what can we do to make that achievable? So she really talks about, again, those explicit instructions and questions. So, for example, some of our students with language disorder will need a lot of explicit information, not implicit information. So if you're explaining something to the class while you're riding on the the whiteboard over here and you're still talking over here, they don't necessarily link that you're still talking to them. They need that link really clear. So potentially pausing your talking while you've turned away from the class to write on the board or to complete something else, and then to face the class to continue your talking. Now, when you're asking them a question, make that really obvious, or when you're giving them an instruction. So rather than saying, oh, do you think you could close the door for me? Probably don't say that. Say, can you get up, close the door for me, please? Great. Another thing to consider is when we're asking them a question, make sure that's obvious, that you're using that inflection at the end of the question. You're using their name to call on them, and you're looking directly at them so they know exactly that that question is directed at them. Now, another thing that came out of Julia Starling's work, she talks a lot about balancing spoken language and visual strategies as well. So this is about not overloading students with auditory information. And in particular, our students with Down syndrome also benefit from a lot of visuals, we know, and also having specific words written down is also going to really help some students. Extra processing time, we've kind of touched on that a little bit. This is going to be different for every student. Some students won't require a lot of processing time at all. For some students, you may need to almost count up to 10 seconds to get a response from them. And that's really difficult when the class is moving so fast and you've got so much to cover in that 45-minute lesson with them. Having that time for their processing time is going to be an extra consideration as well. Now, repeating and rephrasing of information is another thing Julia Starling talks about. So some students do benefit, in particular the students that need more that processing time, will benefit from hearing that instruction a couple of times. And when you're repeating that instruction, not necessarily changing the words. They want to hear it in exactly the same way. Otherwise, if you're adding or changing words each time, that's something new that they then have to get their head around. For other students, though, when it's more of a barrier around their comprehension, this is where we may actually need to rephrase the information. And of course, tools and modifications for our learners, like I said before, they're not an unfair advantage for our students with a language disorder. Sorry, I know I'm running out of time. So very, very quickly, some vocab considerations. We do have a really good webinar on this. If you follow that QR code there, and I'm happy to send this slide out to people as well, or otherwise, if you head to our languagedisorder.org.au page, you'll see that we have a tab there called Professional Learning. And under there, you'll see we have a number of recorded webinars that we've done in the past, and we do still have upcoming webinars. Free feel to sign up to those, because they are free, and they also are free to access, like in terms of the recording. So we do have a really nice webinar that talks about different vocab strategies that you can put in place. So we know that our typically developing students, as soon as they hear a new word 6 to 12 times, that's what it takes for a new word to be added into that semantic system. Our students, however, that have a language disorder, that number is actually 36. So triple the average exposure for our typically developing students. So 36 repetitions of a new word, that's a lot of repetitions to have to consider. So again, thinking about explicit and robust information. When we're giving a definition to a student about a new word, again, that's very explicit, and it's not coming out of a dictionary kind of definition that is not necessarily child-friendly language. So using a child-friendly example to kind of demonstrate the definition of that new word. Giving them any type of multimodal learning as well, that's also going to really make a big impact here. Maximising opportunities to understand, recall, and use new vocabulary. So you may select 4 or 5 new words, for example, and you may use those same 4 or 5 new words in different types of activities. Maybe one is a fill in the gap. Maybe one is put the synonyms together kind of task, for example. So as many of those exposures and repetitions we can use with that same group of words. And of course, demonstrating different strategies for them for when we don't understand new words and we may need to have a closer look. Some strategies we discuss in that vocab webinar, we talk about things like semantic gradients, really good to look up, potentially using a 4-square model or a SEEP model. They're really, really important things as well. And the other difficulty that our students with a language disorder will have might also be that when they're searching for information online, let's say they're doing some sort of essay or a research project, sometimes they may not have the key relevant words to put into Google, especially if that topic is still fairly unfamiliar for them and they don't quite have that vocab. Finally, consider their grammar skills, and this is one that often gets missed, and that's another big area. Again, we do have two really good webinars on this. One is called Sentence Structure, so definitely have a look at that webinar because it discusses in more detail a number of different strategies on how to actually support sentence structure. And next term, our team will also be doing a webinar on morphology, so that word level grammar as well. But things to consider is supporting students to understand how to use a full sentence, or if they've already got their simple sentences, expanding further on that. Shape coding is a really good one to look up as well, and things like colourful semantics could be a good one as well. Everyone wants to take a quick picture of this. I will skip over that just because of time. But really considering here, if you're kind of questioning why students with language disorder aren't asking you questions, sometimes they just don't know what they don't know. It's like me having to ask questions about a topic, maybe something in medicine that I'm not overly familiar with. That's really hard for me to ask a good question about something I don't know. And those are some different strategies that we can support our students. Okay, I know we don't have a lot of time for questions, but again, feel free to use the paddle, is it? So feel free to post any questions there, or come and grab me in the break, that's also fine. Just a quick list of references, and if you also want to sign up to our future webinars and our website, if you go down the end and pop your details in, you can be included in our email campaigns that go out with a lot of free resources, handouts, webinars and things like that. Thanks everyone.